Thank you all for coming along. This is the third in our series of Understanding Copyright webinars with Dr. Ellie Pridgeon, and we will be looking at orphan works today. Ellie is an archives consultant who's worked with a range of heritage organisations, including museums, universities, charities and community archives, and is a copyright consultant for Naomi Corn Associates, and we're delighted to have her again today. The webinar is being recorded, and we would ask all participants to ensure that their cameras and microphones are off during the presentation. But please, at the Q&A at the end, please do feel free to either ask in person or if you want to raise your hands. The chat box is also running, so feel free to type anything in during the webinar. I'll pass you over to Ellie now, who will share her screen, and I hope you all find today useful. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much for that. Just a quick note about the questions at the end. If there are any questions which I can't answer immediately because copyright is ever changing, particularly when it relates to Brexit, then we generally do is I go away and do some research and find out the answer, and then I can kind of email you in due course. Because what I don't want to do is to tell you what I probably think the answer is and not being 100% certain. Obviously, just bear that in mind with the questions, but all being well, they'll be fairly straightforward questions about copyright. So today we are going to be looking at managing orphan works within your heritage organisation. Right, so I'll talk about 45 or 50 minutes, and then there'll be a brief opportunity for a Q&A or discussion session as well. And obviously, you know, this is a session where it's not me telling you things. You know, if you want to share experiences, that's absolutely fine. You know, you can type in the box, etc. You know, so it is also about, you know, everybody sharing their ideas and their knowledge as well. Okay, right. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, great. So I'm assuming that everybody can actually see that. Please, someone shout out if they can't. So here is the screen of the first slide. Okay, so as I said, this is session 3 out of a number of sessions that we're running on copyright. This particular session is about managing orphan works within your heritage collection, and I will discuss a little bit more in just a moment about exactly what orphan works are. Now let me just get rid of this down at the bottom. Sorry. See how that works. Okay, that's absolutely fine. Right, so in the first part of the talk, we're going to be looking at managing orphan works in a generic sense. And also towards the end of the part 1, we're also going to be looking at how Brexit has impacted on the way that we are managing or going to manage, in fact, orphan works. Now, as I said, because Brexit has only just happened, we are a little hazy generally in the sector about exactly how this is going to pan out. Which is why, as I said, you know, at the end, it's you know, questions. Very often it might be a case of having to go away and actually research the answer, because it's all very, very new in terms of Brexit and orphan works. The second part of the talk, I'm going to look at a case study. I'm going to look at the National Jazz Archive that I'm currently been working with. In fact, I'm a trustee now. So I've been working with them, and I'll talk a little bit about the copyright decisions relating to orphan works and how we've been managing copyright for the National Jazz archive. Right, okay, so part one then. So what are orphan works then? Well, orphan works, or in the copyright world, they're referred to as OW, which confused me for a long time because I couldn't work out what OW stood for, but you will get that abbreviation. But I could prefer to call them orphan works because it's clearer and easier to remember what this actually refers to. So orphan works are works where the copyright owner is either unknown or cannot be traced. So they are untraceable. Now, I'm absolutely certain that all of you, or almost all of you, will have orphan works in your collection. Orphan works can be anything in your collection, from photographs to text, letters, for example, audio-visual material, 3D objects, artworks, paintings, pretty much anything in your collection can be an orphan work where you simply just don't know who owns the copyright for it. Now, millions and probably more of archival items in UK heritage institutions, there are millions for which the copyright is unknown or untraceable. So there are literally millions in our collection, and this is a very large and big issue for the heritage sector, as I'm sure that many of you have discovered over the last few years. The issue is, of course, that many of these orphan works are still actually in copyright. And I'll talk a little bit more about the issues surrounding managing orphan works in just a moment. But because obviously they're in copyright, then really at the end of the day, it's very difficult for us to actually make copies of them, digitization, for instance, using them on Twitter. So this is an issue in terms of managing collections in the 21st century. Okay, right. So some of the issues then surrounding orphan works and managing orphan works. So as we know from the previous sessions, as I'm sure all of you know from working in the heritage sector in some capacity, the UK copyright duration is incredibly complex. The last session I did was on copyright duration, and we only just scratched the surface in the first hour, where we went into a lot of detail about the different copyright durations for the different types of material. If you want to mug up on that, if you weren't there for the last session, then my talk is actually online, as they all are, in fact. And the other issue, one of the other issues is that some unpublished orphan works, are still in copyright until 2039, which is actually called the 2039 rule. So this again is an issue. We have several years, if not decades, in which to worry about these types of orphan works. Now, as we know, if the orphan works are still in copyright, heritage organisations cannot use them without the permission of the copyright holder. So you can't put them online, you can't put them on your online catalogue, you can't put them on your website. As I said before, this is a key issue when seeking to manage collections, digitisation, publication. Can't publish them, using them on websites or social media, copying them in any way, for example, making photocopies. Although one, of course, is fine for researchers, and for licensing material. So if you want to license material, we'll talk about that in another session, because this is a very complex issue as well. Another issue associated with orphan works is that very few of these records or items, there are very few records available for researching rights holders for most of these orphan works. So I'll talk about that in just a moment, about how we actually go about researching who the copyright holders are, but there are very few records or even resources, in fact, for doing this. So in terms of managing orphan works in-house, so within your archive or museum or heritage organisation, managing orphan works, like all copyright, is all about managing risk. It's about risk management at the end of the day. So really the first thing that an organisation or you would need to do, if you're thinking about using an orphan work, if you want to use it online or put it on your website, first of all, you need to examine the copyright regulations appropriate to your item collection. So, for example, for photographs or artistic works. Now, another issue with orphan works is if we don't know who the copyright holder is, then often we don't know when the expiry date is. That's the issue, because we don't know when people died. But we have to make an informed judgment about copyright expiry date. Essentially, we have to make some educated guesses. Now, many organisations at this point will actually seek sector or in-house legal or intellectual property rights advice if they are uncertain or unclear about this material. Now, obviously, many heritage organisations, particularly in the 2020s, are not in a position to actually seek external rights advice. Sometimes organisations are lucky enough to have legal in-house. Local government, for example, may be in this position. But if you are in this position, obviously it's a very good practice to start these kind of conversations early on. What you need to do also is conduct what we call a diligent search for the rights owners of every orphan work that you want to use in whatever capacity. It's advised that organisations keep very detailed records of these searches that you undertake. So these might be, for example, I know that many organisations will use an Excel spreadsheet, essentially, to record these different searches. It's essentially a kind of copyright database with all sorts of different columns with different headings, and also the names of the researchers who are actually undertaking this research as well. As part of this research, the diligent search, you need to demonstrate that you are actually tracing the copyright owners. So you need to include evidence. So your copyright database needs to be linked to things like email chains, saved in a PDFA, for example. That's very often how organisations will actually manage that. I'll talk a bit at the end, actually, about the new advice that the National Archives has just issued. And I have to say, I only found out about it at the end of last week, so I haven't had time to read it yet, but I'll talk a little bit about that right at the end. Right, so in terms of managing orphan works, tracing orphan works, then, if a work has more than one rights owner, as we saw in the last session, you often get multiple rights holder within an item. Audiovisual, for example, is a good example of that, where we have, different copyright holders. Films, for example, where you have, the soundtrack, the producer, the actors, this kind of thing. So if the work has more than one rights owner within it, you need to undertake a diligent search for all the different rights holders. So it could be, sometimes it's 5 or 6 rights holders for one piece of work, for instance. And if one or more of the rights owners is actually known, and that's often the case, you need to seek copyright permissions as usual before you actually use this material online. You also need at this point to carry out a risk assessment to establish whether your organisation is actually going to use this work or not. So as I said, it's all about managing risk, and the ultimate decision, as we'll see a bit later on, it often depends on how risk averse your organisation is. And because of this kind of decision about whether you're going to use an item online or not should ideally be taken at senior management level. Many organisations, if they decide to go ahead with putting an orphan work online, even though they don't know who the copyright owner is, and it may still be in copyright, what they will do is have a takedown notice and procedures, for example, on the website. And I'll just talk about that a little bit right at the end. But I'm sure that many of you are familiar with that. And also, if the organisation is in a position to do so, the heritage institution should have appropriate indemnity insurance to cover any claims. So these claims, the indemnity insurance should include copyright, in fact, or copyright infringements. Okay, right. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about tracing orphan works. Now, obviously, some of you will be familiar with these, or some of them, or all of them. Some of you will have used them. But I'll just give an overview of some of the key kind of ports of call if you're tracing the rights owners of an item from your collection. The first port of call is generally what we call watch. That's the writers, artists, and their copyright holders. I've put the hyperlink in there. Obviously, I'm going to be sharing these slides later, so you don't need to worry about writing those down or anything. So Watch is a cooperative research project between the University of Reading and the University of Texas. It has a strong literary emphasis, but has recently been extended. It's extended its remit due to user demand. So Watch now collects and includes information about copyright holders of visual artists, living or dead, photographers, sculptors, non-literary authors, and also even celebrities as well. So it's definitely worth familiarizing yourself with that website. I mean, it's very useful anyway, and interesting as well, because you literally can just do a search on a name, Smith, for example, and it will bring up all the relevant copyright information about relevant artists. I use that in creators. I use that in the broadest sense. There's also the FOB as well for tracing orphan works, and this is useful if you're particularly if, for example, you're looking for a publisher. If you're working with a published work, sometimes, you know, we all have, as we'll see later, we all have magazines in our collection, journals, this kind of thing. Firms Out of Business, FOB, is also a very useful website. It is like Watch, in fact, a partnership between Reading and Texas. It's also a sister project of Watch, and it holds information about vanished publishing concerns, literary agencies, and similar firms as well. So this is useful, as I said, if you have published works and you're trying to trace the publisher. We'll have a look at that in relation to the Jazz Archive in just a moment. Other research options which are useful to us in the heritage sector. So we have TinEye reverse image search, for example. This is useful if you have photographic orphan works in your collection. It is an image search and recognition company and website as well. So you literally just upload your image, your photograph onto the website, and it will do a scan and search to see if it has anything which looks vaguely similar. The aim is to essentially make images searchable online, and it's very useful for tracing photographic duplicates in other collections, modify copies of image in your collections, and also for image verification as well. So if you don't know what is, what your photograph is at all, if you have no information about a photograph, which is very often the case in our collections. Yes, and in terms of tracing orphan works, other research options and other ways that heritage organisations will research the orphan works to try and find out who the copyright holder is. Well, some of these are fairly straightforward, online Google searches and image searches as well, Google image search. Contacting licensing agencies and image libraries, literary agents, press agencies. Contacting professional bodies, for example, the BAPLA, or the Association of Authors Agents, or the Society of Authors. Consulting the Writer's Handbook, or consulting the Artist Papers Registers, which gives details of artists held in publicly accessible archives, libraries and galleries and museums in the UK, although this unfortunately is not a kind of copyright resource, but it's still obviously useful when you're undertaking your research. And some organisations or individuals will even end up trying to trace copyright ownership through wills and probates, because very often estates are kind of passed down through the families, for instance. But that's usually the kind of the last thing that individuals or researchers will try. It's a lot easier to do the more straightforward and accessible online searches to start with. Right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the other options for essentially managing and dealing with orphan works in the UK in 2021. So one of the solutions which has been around for a few years now is the Orphan Works licensing scheme. This is run by the Intellectual Property Office, or the IPO, and I've put the hyperlink up there. Now, the Orphan Works licensing scheme provides renewable licenses for 7 years for orphan works in UK institutions. So for 7 years, or until the copyright owner turns up. In fact, it's for both commercial and non-commercial use. You must undertake a very diligent search, and there's a checklist which you have to complete. So it's very time consuming, in fact. The scheme is unfortunately been very unsuccessful because there has been very low usage by heritage organisations in the UK. I mean, some of the issues include the admin fees, which are not large to begin with, but they soon add up. And I think you can only do up to 30 items at a time, which is obviously not great for mass digitisation projects. And there's also it only provides limited coverage, so it's UK only. So the online coverage is actually very, very limited. So it can be used in the UK for publishing, for instance, and kind of hard copy, things which are being produced in hard copy. But organisations are not happy about using it for online material, because, of course, online material can be accessed by anybody around the world. It's a global audience suddenly. So this is not a successful or a popular solution. Now, I'm just going to talk about what the other option, and this is pre-Brexit. This is not an option for us now, unfortunately, but just to place it into context, and also to talk a little bit about what we've actually lost through Brexit. Now, so we're talking here about the EU rather than the UK. So before Brexit, the EU Orphan Works Directive, this was implemented in the EU in 2012 and implemented into the UK in 2014. It was a very helpful development at the time that encouraged heritage institutions to digitise material for websites, online catalogues, and also for publications as well. Obviously, like the other scheme, you had to, in the past, undertake reasonable searches to identify rights holders. You had to also register the information on the EU IPO Orphan Works database, and you could use the material for website publication with a much reduced risk. Now, as I said, this is no longer accessible to us in the UK because we've left the EU, obviously, so it's no longer relevant. That those of us, countries across the Channel can still use this. So again, pre-Brexit, heritage institutions were able to use the Orphan Works exception for online works. So obviously the Orphan Work exception is key here. But the directive was not really used very much, rather like the UK version, partly due to technical issues with the database, and only around 14 institutions, in fact, by the end of 2020, had actually used the EU Orphan Works Directive. And as I said, this ceased to be applicable when the UK left the EU on the 1st of January 2021. So many copyright experts are very worried about the fact that the UK can no longer, or UK institutions can no longer actually use this Orphan Works Directive. So there's really, Brexit has had quite a negative impact upon how we can manage orphan works. And as we know, UK copyright and Brexit, as we know, the UK left the EU on the 1st of January, which meant that the copyright arrangements between the EU member states ceased, or largely ceased, not completely. I'll talk about that in a moment. And there was a change in the way the copyright is managed and protected as well. UK institutions previously using the Orphan Works exception in the UK can no longer rely on this as a basis from 2021, as I've already said. But they may have used it. Well, we know of 14 organisations who used it in the past, but it's not relevant to us now. Just a little bit more about Brexit as well. I'm not going to go into great amount of detail because it's incredibly complex, and we still don't know what's happening because it's all so new. But most UK copyright works are still protected in the EU and vice versa. And the UK is still involved in international treaties on copyright, such as the Berne Convention, which is the international agreement. It's still a signatory of that. And projects such as Europeana, which is a sharing cultural heritage site. This has also been unaffected as well. So there are still some kind of agreements in place. One of the issues we think is going to be with Brexit and copyright is that the EU Court of Justice judgments, obviously made after the 1st of January 2021, no longer influence UK law, which may, we think will probably be an issue going forwards, because it's good practice to actually have influence from elsewhere and from other countries as well. So this is a bit of a worry for leading copyright experts at this time, but obviously judgments made before the 1st of January are still relevant to UK law interpretation. But as I said, I'm not going to go into lots of details about that, because this session is more about the kind of hands-on approach to how to managing orphan works, really. Okay, right, and the other thing which we have unfortunately missed out on or lost because of leaving the EU is the EU Copyright Directive. As I said at the top, this is not relevant to the UK, but it gives us it shows us where, it's a potentially worrying time for heritage organisations at the moment. So in the spring 2021, the EU implemented the new copyright directive. So this is very recent, in fact. This allows heritage institutions in the EU to use in copyright works without permissions, including orphan works, in an online environment. So this would be excellent for the UK. For the UK, this doesn't apply in the UK. So therefore, you know, our solutions have been very, very limited by Brexit. It's highly likely that the UK will not implement the EU copyright directive in any way, shape, or form. I mean, apart from anything else, the UK government is now snowed under by Brexit and COVID for the foreseeable future. And it is also likely that the UK will not alter any copyright legislation regarding orphan works and exceptions as well. So the risk here is that the gap between the EU and the UK will grow, the gap between the kind of copyright legislation, which may impact to a certain extent on collaboration with organisations overseas. But again, that's a whole different session, essentially. So I'm not going to go into any detail about that now. I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what we have lost out on in terms of leaving the EU in terms of copyright. And the copyright experts at the top, they're very worried about this, you know, about the impact of Brexit. Right, okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides to go on or backwards. Right, so the options are then, in terms of just a summary for the first part, then the options, us in the heritage sector, then just to sum up, are so our options are 4 essentially. We can first of all use the UK government Orphan Works licensing scheme, but you have to pay for this, and this really max out if you want to do a mass digitisation project, which is going to be very expensive for you anyway. You know, you might be spending £20,000 or £50,000 on digitisation. You know, the last thing you want on top of this is also an administrative fee from the Orphan Works licensing scheme through the IPO. So that's the first option, is to use the licensing scheme. The second option is to undertake a risk assessment for the use of orphan works in-house. So some organisations, as we'll see in just a moment, depending on the type of material, will actually go forward and take the risk of putting that material online, even though it may still be in copyright. The third option is to refrain from using orphan works altogether and decide that you're only going to use works which you hold the copyright for, you know who the copyright holders are. And the fourth option is to use the copyright exceptions for orphan works. So, for example, you know, as I talked about in the last session, the on-site terminals, the preservation exception, where we can digitize material, particularly, for example, audio-visual, which is subject to preservation risks. We're in danger of actually losing access to that. But of course, that material, you can't put it online. It has to be on site only on dedicated terminals, or the quotation exception, where we, for example, which we haven't talked much about, but I'm looking in one of the next sessions that we'll do is on exhibition. So I'll have a bit more about how we can actually use quotations then. So that's another option of kind of getting around the use of orphan works. You know, our solutions are much more limited than they were a year ago, unfortunately. But let's, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. So what I want to do in the second part of the talk, yeah, it really doesn't like me trying to change screens. That's a bit better. Okay, so what I want to talk about in the second part of the talk is the case study, and I'm going to look at the National Jazz Archive, which is a fantastic collection. Here we have a screenshot from the website. I'll talk a little bit about what the National Jazz Archive is about before I go on to talk about how they manage or have been managing copyright over the last few months. As you can see here, the National Jazz Archive is all about working for the past, present and future of jazz. And if you're interested in finding out more, I've put the links to the website down at the bottom here. It also has a Twitter feed and a Facebook site, and also an Instagram account as well. So you can go and have a look at those. Browse what they have in their collections. It has a very strong online catalogue as well. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about the National Jazz Archive then, which is an absolutely fantastic collection, I have to say. So the aims and objectives of the National Jazz Archive: so collecting materials, documenting jazz heritage, preserving holdings to professional standards, developing more representative and inclusive collections, facilitating the study of jazz history, heritage and culture, and engaging with a wide range of communities through collections and activities. Okay, right, so what does that mean in reality then? Well, just a quick overview of the organisation and some of the key items in the collection before we go on to look at the copyright aspect. So the National Jazz Archive, or the NJA, was founded in 1988 by the British jazz cornet player and author and broadcaster Digby Fairweather, and you can see him on the right in one of these photographs. He's a lifelong patron of the NJA. So the NJA collections are held both at Loughton in Essex, so just outside London, or part of London really now. And also some of the collections are also at the Birmingham City University collection as well. So it's a split site for various reasons, mainly to do with preservation. So the National Jazz Archive is the most comprehensive resource story of jazz in the whole of the UK. The collection documents the development of jazz, as well as the story of art and fashion and cultural diversity, and also social progress as well. And much of the material is available online. So as I said, with link there, it has an excellent online catalogue that you can browse with images as well. So which is excellent. Right, so collections. The collections include written, printed, visual and audio-visual material from the 1920s onwards. This includes photographs, journals, books, posters, programs, personal collections, objects and oral history as well. And the archive attracts academic researchers and general users from all over the world. The Jazz Archive is currently cataloguing, digitising and making material accessible on their online website. Again, that is the link to copyright that I'll talk about in just a moment. It also hosts fundraising concerts by leading jazz musicians, talks by expert writers, researchers and music specialists, and also hosts exhibitions, workshops and open days as well. A recent example of an exhibition is 2018, where the NJA organised the Women in Jazz exhibition at the Barbican. The exhibition focused on jazz instrumentalists and highlighted how political and social change has played a role in women's growing involvement in jazz music. Items from the NJA collection we're exhibiting, including photographs, posters, journals, videos, and memorabilia. Okay, right, so I hope you've got a bit of an overview of the National Jazz Archive and the types of collections that it holds. So let me, before we tie up, let me talk a little bit about essentially how the organisation has been managing some of its orphan works recently. So you won't be unsurprised to hear, because this is relevant for almost every collection. The NJA collection includes orphan works, of course. So a good example that I'm going to talk to you about now is the Ballroom and Band. I put the image on the right here. This is, or was, a monthly magazine which was published between 1934 and 1935. The magazines contain material relating to dance tuition, record reviews, dance fashion, and concert and band news. And until 2001, so 2021, earlier this year, the Ballroom and Band were available in the NJA reading room, but not online due to copyright restrictions. So the decision had ultimately been made not to put them online at that point, or up to that point. Now, the National Jazz Archive is, it has on its team, it has a professional lawyer, which is obviously excellent. So the way that it manages copyright is very, it's kind of quite high level, very high level, I would have to say, because it has a lot of in-house expertise, legal expertise. So it's a very good example, essentially, for this session. Now, extensive research has been undertaken over the last few months and years, even in-house, to identify the copyright holders for Ballroom and Band. Now, it was discovered that the publishers of Ballroom and Band were actually the Rolls House Publishing Company. However, extensive research has been carried out and there is no trace of what happened to them at all. Grace's Guide to Just to a History, which is a kind of resource which is available online, lists 3 other publications produced by the same company in the 1930s. But there's no other kind of link or trail that the National Jazz Archive can follow to find out more about the Rolls House Publishing Company. We therefore think that they were probably a short-lived company who produced only 5 editions of Ballroom and Band before, we think, probably closing down. So in 2021, so this very year, the decision was made to publish the older Ballroom and Band on the NJA website, despite the copyright risks. Now, a risk assessment was undertaken, and it was decided that there's nothing to suggest that publishing would infringe the intellectual property interests of any living people. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't know whether this, whether the publishers hold the copyright for the content of Ballroom and Band, or whether it's the authors. There are obviously no contracts which exist. They probably weren't even used at the time. So very often we don't. It's that there's. We essentially, at the end of the day, have absolutely no idea about these individuals, but it's highly likely that if somebody writing for the magazine, if they were copyright holders, then it's highly likely that they would be no longer with us, because they'd be probably over 100 years old. So this being the case, the decision was taken that, as I said, they wouldn't infringe the intellectual property interests of the living people. The ultimate decision was that the risk of litigation for breach of copyright was a very remote possibility. So the NJA therefore implemented a 6-month test period with monitoring and a takedown procedure. So essentially, if anybody comes out of the woodwork and claims to be the copyright holder, then the material would be taken down. Now, this was also the case just a few months later. The decision was also made, the same decision was made for Tune Times. So Tune Times, as you can see pictured here, was a British music magazine which was published between 1934 and 1935. So again, a very short run. It was once the leading musical monthly magazine. There was a complete sequence at the NJA, but again, it didn't run for very long. Now, Tune Times is an orphan work as well. The content includes cartoons, adverts, articles, photographs. Some of these are attributed and some of them are not. Some of the authors are attributed, for example. Sometimes some of the cartoons are attributed. But there's absolutely no trace of the publisher at all, or the publisher is still in existence. So again, it's likely that it was a very kind of short-term organisation. So for both of these, actually, for both of these examples that I'm talking about, the initial research was undertaken using a copyright checklist. And it was actually established that because the research would take hundreds and hundreds of hours, that it was unlikely ever to happen. So this was another kind of deciding factor in making the decisions to put this material online. The idea that it would take so long, so much research, that it would never actually happen. No one would actually ever sit down and do that work at all. So this again, that was also linked to the kind of risk factor. So with this material, as well as with the previous material as well, an in-house risk assessment was undertaken. And again, like the previous material, nothing to suggest that publishing online would infringe the intellectual property interests. The individuals, the authors would almost certainly be no longer with us. So therefore, at the end of the day, again, for this material, the decision was made to publish the older Tune Times magazines on the NJA website, again, with a takedown policy attached to them and a 6-month test procedure, and also monitoring as well of any response. Now, I'll just talk before I finish very quickly about the takedown procedures, the notices on the website which accompany the images if you'll make the decision to put up any copyrighted works or orphan works, for instance. So, the wording is, this is very loose. All reasonable efforts have been made to ensure that intellectual property rights displayed in these works have not been infringed. If you do not believe this is the case, please contact them then with the name, the email address. But the NJA decided against actually putting this online with the images because it decided, from its own point of view, reasonable efforts had not actually been undertaken to identify the copyright owners, because particularly for the Tune Times and also for other material as well, it was really, they just kind of started to research this and it only got so far. So they see this not as actually a reasonable effort. So they've deliberately made the, they've deliberately gone with not actually putting this on the website at all. They do still have a takedown procedure, essentially, although it's not on the website, in the sense that if anyone complains, then the material will be removed, which is, of course, the way that most heritage organisations will manage any orphan works they end up putting online. But I also think with this material as well, because it's so old, it's it's getting on for, it'll be almost 100 years old relatively soon. So the risk is absolutely minimal. It's very, very minimal. And in many cases, the older the material is, the kind of less risky it is, perhaps. But at the end of the day, it's very much down to the individual organisation and their particular appetite for risk about, what decision they make about managing this material and what they are actually going to do with the material, whether it's going to be available online or not. Okay, right. So just very quickly then, before we finish, then I've just put up some further reading then about orphan works, online resources. Well, the National Archives has now produced its orphan works document here, guidance document, which, as I said, I haven't actually had time to read properly yet, but it's not very long, but it's brand new, or almost brand new as well. So it's very manageable. It's not one of these documents that's 100 pages long, but it's so it's very easy to kind of to look at and read. Into the IPO, for example, of course, has lots of very useful information about orphan works and copyright of orphan works on the website there. Also have a look, as I said in the previous session, at the Heritage Digital Resources. I put the link up there. There are lots of copyright resources there. They've been working in conjunction with Naomi Corn Associates, and they and Naomi Corn have actually produced a kind of Brexit document, a PDF, which is excellent actually, and it's quite long, but it's very easy to read the way that they set it out. So you can, so this relates to copyright, and there's also one that relates to Brexit and data protection as well. So you can get that either from the Heritage Digital site, or also they're also both on the Naomi Corn Associates resources page as well. So if you looked at you will find it there. It's named something like copyright and Brexit, or intellectual property right and Brexit. So absolutely have it if you're interested in kind of researching this area further. And as I usually point out in most of these sessions, if you're publications which are essential, Naomi Corn and Gordon McKenna's copyright, available from the Collections Trust. You can buy it online. I just bought it on, it's relatively inexpensive. It's under £20. Actually, it's well worth it, the investment. It's relatively straightforward. It's not complex in any way, but it's useful. It's very practical, as the title suggests. And then if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, then of course there's Corns and Oppenheim's and Muir's Information Law 2020, and then Tim Padfield's Copyright for Archivists, which has been essentially, there's a revised edition from 2019. But obviously, unfortunately, neither of those publications, in fact, none of the publications now are entirely relevant because of Brexit, essentially. So, all being well, someone's going to write a completely new book on copyright and Brexit. That would be very useful to fill the gap. Right, okay, so right, so that's the end of my talk. So I don't know whether anyone's got any questions, or we've got any questions in the box, or there's anything that we need to discuss useful for people.
Thank you very much, Ellie. No questions come in through the chat box just now, but if anybody would like to add any, please do. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, I will, or turn on your microphone and camera, please ask away. Okay, we've had one question from Vanessa, which I'll read on risk for historic ephemera in political and community archives, such as 1970s and 80s political posters or leaflets. If people are activists, then even if we can't find out exactly who designed this or that poster, we know that they are likely to be sympathetic to its use by a volunteer archive with the same political outlook. Is it legitimate to take that into account when assessing risk?
Yeah, absolutely. That's yeah. I'm just rereading the question. Yeah. So basically, it's material which is created by activists. So there's not, almost certainly not going to be a kind of a string of evidence which is pointing to who the copyright holder is, because it may just have been made on someone's typewriter or whatever. I think the main thing, with these orphan works is essentially to demonstrate that you have, in fact, attempted to find out who the copyright holder is at the end of the day. So you need to demonstrate due diligence, which means doing a certain amount of research. You set aside some time to kind of, and also, as well as doing that, you need, obviously, as I said in the talk, to be able to demonstrate that, to evidence that, have your email strings, your correspondence with somebody who was involved in that, essentially. And then at the end of the day, yeah, it's a case of if you still don't, have no solutions to this, and which is a big problem, particularly for community archives. These types of activist archives, it's an issue all round. Then at that point, you can then take the risk. I think that at the end of the day, it's very much up to the individual institution. So, I don't want to be in a position where I'm saying kind of, yes, do this, or no, do that, because it's very much up to the individual institution and up to their kind of top level approach to risk assessment. I mean, with the National Jazz Archive, we ultimately made a decision to put that material online because it is low risk, essentially. And this material as well is, I would imagine, kind of relatively low risk, although perhaps not as low risk because it's not quite as old. So I think essentially at the end of the day, you kind of need to draw out some kind of pros and cons, and then kind of, discuss this with stakeholders, essentially take it to, don't just make a decision one person on their own. That's the other thing. It's really important that this decision is made by all stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders, essentially, at the end of the day. So you can kind of have that discussion. And then you may feel that you are in the position, with a takedown notice, to put this material up, because you feel as if you've actually done everything you were supposed to do, the due diligence, the collecting the evidence, essentially, and then making that decision at a high level. Does that answer? I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. I also think it's answered a couple of other ones that have come in too. Okay. Just one actually sort of following up on that is, are there any statistics on how many heritage institutions have been questioned after putting orphan works online, for example? How big is the risk?
That is a very good point. I haven't worked with any organisations who have, personally, it's not to say that it hasn't happened, but I haven't worked with any heritage organisations which have had these kind of issues or a comeback. What I think, obviously, if you're working for a large national institution, then they're very, a lot of, for example, when I'm working for the Imperial War Museum, there's a lot of material that we're just, the decision is made not to put an image online just because it's too complex. Whereas if you're working for a community organisation, for example, then depending on who you're working with, but it might be that you know, essentially it might be that they, so sorry, the question was, sorry, can you just repeat the question again? I need to write it down. Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it was how big is the risk, and if there are any organisations that have been sort of challenged.
Yeah, well, there's smaller organisations. I think if you're a community organisation, for example, I think as long as you do your due diligence, you ask around, you ask the community, you ask your stakeholders, you ask people living in the village, you put it in the magazine, you know, the village magazine, this kind of thing. I think, you know, I think that if you've done that, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to get, you know, a kind of comeback on that. Because, you know, if there had been somebody, they would have come forward. So I think, you know, it's all about managing this. So I haven't actually been in a situation where this has been an issue. Well, I have been in a situation when it's an issue, when it's managed like that. Well, I have been in an institution. I have actually been one organisation that I work with. They actually, many years ago, this is right back when Twitter started, but they tweeted some photographs that were not their copyright, but taken off somebody else's website, but it was something that was relevant to their Twitter feed. And actually, I don't know how, but the person on Twitter who owned the website noticed and basically, you know, wrote a letter of a very, very strongly worded letter of complaint, basically telling the organisation to take this material off their Twitter feed. But as I said, this was many years ago, before, you know, before Brexit, and you know, before we really knew how social media actually worked or should be working. You know, we're not a lot more kind of alert to the pros and cons, particularly as archivists now. So I suppose the answer to the question is that, you know, I haven't come across organisations being asked to take material down from their website, but certainly in terms of social media, that does happen much more, I think, essentially.
No, that's super. Thank you very much, Ellie. That's us at time. Apologies for not answering other questions, but some of the other ones that come in are really quite big areas that we will certainly, especially one about sort of digitization and photographic images, we will be covering at a later in a later session. And I think that we don't want to get into it just now because I think it will be quite a large topic in itself. So apologies. I'd just like to thank Ellie very much again for giving her presentation today. And as she mentioned, the next session will be on exhibitions, both real ones and online ones. And we will it'll be sometime in October, hopefully, and we will sort of advertise when booking is available. Thank you all very much for coming along today, and thank you again very much, Ellie.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time, all being well.